Yeah, so as Sandy mentioned, talking about monitoring-driven development, which is sort of a play on the ideas of test-driven development from the agile software development movement. So I think that in the data engineering space, we're kind of watching a set of paradigm shifts unfold. If you're like me, you probably started with a kind of project mindset. So you were thinking about projects where you were delivering some kind of data artifact, maybe a report to a stakeholder. There was always, they wanted some level of some number of features by some specific date. We all know how that goes. And success was that your stakeholder accepted the data, artifact that you gave them, and then you moved on to the next project. Then I think as the automation tools started to mature, we moved to what I call the pipelines mindset. So we were basically using automation to do the manual steps that we had been doing before, but we still had something of a project mindset. We were just doing more automation when delivering that project. So we were still trying to deliver something automatically, but by a certain date. Success moved from acceptance by the stakeholder to your pipeline succeeding or not succeeding, and when you were finished, you moved on to making the next pipeline. And replay that cycle a couple of times, and I'm sure we've all had the experience where you have a whole bunch of pipelines, some of them are failing and no one's quite sure, who cares whether the failure is a problem or not. So I think that what's happening now, where I think lots of us are going and where Dagster is leading the way, is this shift from a project mindset to what I think of as a product, or perhaps an sort of data assets mindset. So instead of thinking about the pipeline that creates the asset, we shift the focus to instead talk about the actual data asset itself. We make that a first-class citizen. We talk about the data asset that our team maintains and that our stakeholders use for things like drawing those reports. And we shift into a sort of incremental delivery pattern where we get feedback and engagement from our stakeholders, and we use that to guide how we improve that data asset. We also shift, instead of having automation that's just used to create the asset, we also have automation that validates that the asset is available and has the quality criteria that our stakeholders expect. And only once we have all of that in place do we do the familiar work of creating pipelines to create the asset. And then we have a much more iterative approach where we look at, well, are our stakeholders asking for more data in this asset? Let's prioritize that work. Are our quality monitors showing us that the existing asset isn't being updated frequently enough, or that there's errors? Well, let's focus our attention on that. So to make that a little bit more concrete, in the Dagster world, in the pipelines asset, which we have been using pre version 13, our pipelines would look something along the lines of a pipeline is going to do some work, so do the daily work job, and it had a set of operations that we strung together very nicely, and those operations, some of them kind of some assets sort of like fell out of the bottom of this pipeline. But our focus was very much on building the pipeline. Is the pipeline succeeding? And I think that if we make that paradigm shift to thinking about assets, which the new features in Dagster 13 and now 14 help us to do, we can shift into much more of a sort of data product focused mindset, and we can start by publishing an MVP asset to the Dagster asset catalog and putting that front and center in front of our stakeholders to get feedback early on, before we've even written any pipelines to generate that asset. Because as we all know, changes at this stage are significantly cheaper than changes later on in the process. We also can start by writing, and this is the kind of monitoring driven, start by writing the monitors that validate that our asset is some level of quality, and we expect it to fail in the beginning. But now we have something that we know once we've implemented some logic, we know when we're finished because now these monitors are succeeding. It's also a great way to sort of demonstrate to our stakeholders why our data assets are trustworthy. We can sort of show them this is the automation that we have that validates that the data assets are good, and this is how frequently they're good and how frequently they're bad. And only at that stage do we get onto actually implementing the asset creation logic. So this is the traditional, create pipeline sort of steps, but it's done in a way that we have a much clearer target, and we know when we've reached that target due to the previous two steps. And then we don't finish and move on to the next sort of project or pipeline. Now we think of now we iterate on that asset. We get feedback from the stakeholders, from the automation, and we use that to prioritize adding more data, perhaps improving the quality, and so forth. And so success in this paradigm looks like a team owning some data products, some long-lived data assets with good quality and monitoring, and you always know what's important to the team, where you should focus your attention. All right, that's lots of theory. Let me show you some code. So this, I hope, will be merged into the standard set of examples once this pull request gets merged under the monitoring-driven software-defined assets example. So first step here, publish the MVP asset to get some early stakeholder feedback. So we want the simplest possible thing that we can write in Dagster. We want to write some logic to validate the properties of that asset, and then we can even use the same validation graph in to sort of drive our acceptance tests while we're developing. So let me show you what that looks like. Right. So what I have here is a very simple implementation of a Dagster asset. Up here is its schema, and down here is the definition of the asset and conforming to that schema. And when I load this up inside Dagit, whoopsie. Come on, there we go, mouse control, there we go. All right, so have a look at this. So we want to kind of publish this this very basic asset schema with no actual data in it yet into our asset catalog and get our stakeholders engaged about, is this the thing that they were expecting? Is this the definition when they talk about a customer being active, for example? Is this data that's presenting helpful for them? How are we going to partition keeping this thing up to date? So here we've kind of arbitrarily chosen daily, but maybe that's the wrong thing. We can get them used to the idea that as automation runs, they can come back to this asset catalog page to see this, the state of the data asset. So here we go. So we filled in one partition, and here we go. We can see that one of the 6 partitions is now filled with some test data. But more importantly than that, we can also start showing them how we're going to validate the quality of this data. So in this case, the implementation that I did was the simplest possible thing. I just I made a view in my data mart with some static data in it. So it just happens to work for that date, but obviously it won't work for any future dates. So I can write a Dagster pipeline that is focused not so much on the creation of the data, but on the validation of the data that's in the mart. And so I can have a set of graphs around validating specific data assets. and within those they can have a particular set of conditions. So it should conform to some schema. It should contain perhaps some current date, and then the actual implementation of these is, so here's an implementation of one of those validation operations. It should contain current data, and this is just, you can put whatever logic you wish in here to validate whatever the thing that you're validating is. But the key is that by yielding an asset observation, you can link the result of this test back to the actual asset in the asset catalog. So let's show that in action. So I'm going to oops, I should probably do that for one of the days we actually have data. And so this just looks like a regular Dagster pipeline, but instead of it having steps that create data, it's actually got steps that validate the data. And then because I'm raising asset observations, we can see that this one conforms to the schema. I was expecting one of these to be a failure. But if something went wrong in the asset validation, then it would show up here as a problem against this particular partition, and you could see what the cause of that problem was. Oh, and then finally, I mentioned that we can use that this same job that we ran manually over here, and that we can use Dagster's scheduling capabilities to run for us automatically. We can run that same job, but kind of in a PyTest context, to help drive our actual implementation development. So I'm using the PyTest parameterize feature to just check to execute this this monitoring job and then validate that all of the steps succeed. So now I get a set of unit tests that I can use to guide my development implementation. So, for example, it should conform to the schema step worked, but it should contain current data didn't work. So I get a nice helpful error that helps me when I'm doing my implementation. All right, so that's phase one. Just to recap, so we talked about publishing the asset as one of the first things that you do in the asset catalog, and what we're trying to do is get early feedback from our stakeholders and trigger the kind of questions that sort of come up. Can you actually access this location in the data mart? It's a big one I bump into a lot. The perennial, oh, what do you mean when you say a customer? Especially if you're in a corporate environment, as a customer, the subsidiary or the parent company or the one that pays the bills. And you can have conversations about the required grain. We've assumed daily here. Maybe actually this is something that needs to be done hourly, or maybe it's much slower. Maybe we just need something quarterly. But having those conversations early on can really impact how you go about implementing things. Then we talked about writing a validation job where each operation is a check for the data quality as opposed to something that makes data, and using the asset observation type to kind of link that metadata from the validation run into the asset catalog. And then finally using the same validation pipeline but run inside a unit test context to serve as your acceptance test while you're implementing the features. All right, phase two. Now that you have set the stage Now it's time to get on to the bit that used to be step one, which is actually developing the logic to put the asset in the right place. So what I think we should be doing under this paradigm is to first deploy our monitoring and see that it's failing and failing in a way that we expect. Are the error messages we see in the monitoring helpful? Do they tell us which environment, for example, the failure is occurring on? And then we just need to implement the simplest first thing to sort of pass the validation that we have running. Simpler is better is always my approach. And maybe we begin just by having some manual steps. Maybe we don't have a fully automated process in the beginning because we're still learning about the problem that we want to automate. You can't automate something you don't understand. And you definitely don't want to be doing things like worrying about performance optimizations or any of those. Those are, things. Once this asset is used and important, that's the time to invest in that, not at this early stage. And then finally, we can use the monitoring and the associated acceptance test to tell us when our implementation is good enough. Looking at the time, I'm going to skip over the phase 2 demo, but let me just show you sort of by the recap. So you would have deployed your monitoring and it would have failed for some amount of time, and then finally once you deployed your implementation that worked, now you would have started to have your monitoring starting to succeed. Your first implementation can be really simple. Perhaps rather than doing a whole lot of logic to compute the daily information, you just do that manually and stick it in a CSV or a spreadsheet and have that be imported. Whatever is the simplest thing to get data in front of your stakeholders, data that passes the quality monitoring. And then phase 3 is to iterate on your solution and to prioritize where you focus based on the feedback that you're getting from your stakeholders. Are they asking for more data? Are they asking for a different schema? Is the update schedule, maybe they want to change that? Or your automated asset monitoring. Are we finding that things fail on Monday mornings because the system is overloaded? Maybe we need to implement some retry logic. Are we finding upstream data quality issues? And maybe you in fact get no feedback at all. And that's probably a signal that perhaps people don't really care about this thing that you thought was an asset, and you can focus your attention on something else instead. Some further ideas. You could add notifications based on the monitoring job to let you know about problems before your stakeholders notice them. There's no reason that your monitoring job should only be limited to monitoring your assets. As we saw, the monitoring operations are just a Python function. You can do whatever you like in them. Maybe there's a set of upstream assets that you depend on that would be helpful to monitor. Or maybe you want to monitor something downstream. Is the data that you're producing that someone is copying into an S3 bucket, is it getting there without being corrupted? That'd be something that you could monitor as well. And then finally, you can start to use the monitoring as the beginnings of some kind of data service level agreement with your stakeholders. You might say something like, a particular data asset will be stale no more than 10 days per quarter, for example. And you have a nice measuring system because the days when your monitors failed are the days when that asset was stale. So to sort of visualize that, we've got here's our monitoring system running. We're running it on a schedule, and I think this is quite subtle, but I think important. You want to pick a schedule that's relevant to your stakeholders, which doesn't necessarily have to be the same schedule as the automation that creates the asset runs on. Maybe that runs in the middle of the night, but your stakeholders tend to sort of check their reports or refresh their reports first thing in the morning. So let's run some validation that the asset is still available and correct at about the time when they're about to look at it. We talked about adding alerts so that you can notice when there's a problem before your stakeholder, calls you in a panic. And we talked about how we've got a very simple way. So assuming that we're running our validation functions using partitioning, we can use the partitions view to sort of, see which days it was successful and which days it was unsuccessful, and our SLA can become something simple like no more than a certain number of red dots every quarter. All right, so recapping. So we talked about this whole idea of monitoring-driven development is part of this paradigm shift that we're seeing, and that Dagster is helping to drive, this move away from pipelines and towards assets. And the approach that you follow is you start by publishing information about the asset upfront, so you can get stakeholder feedback nice and early. You can try drive that in engagement, and you can make changes when it's cheapest to make changes. You use your Dagster pipelines to actually drive asset monitoring, and we're testing the quality of our assets from the stakeholder perspective, not necessarily from the producer's perspective. And we're verifying, we're asking our stakeholders to place trust in our data assets, so we should have a mechanism of verifying why they should give us that trust. And it's only once you've done steps 1 and 2 that you get to what used to be step 1, which is to actually implement the asset creation logic. But you've got a nice set of guides to tell you what you're aiming for and when you're there, when when the monitoring job starts to pass. And then instead of finishing and moving on to the next project, now we iterate to try and make this asset better. Where, based on feedback, we add more data, or maybe we improve the quality or the reliability of something. And success in this new paradigm looks like a team that has a bunch of long-lived data assets with a well-known quality, some kind of SLI driven by our monitoring, and then we're thinking about selling the same assets to additional stakeholders rather than being on the perpetual treadmill of just doing the next project. And that's it. I'm not sure about timing. If there are questions, please just add them to the Zoom chat, and I'll answer them, and I'll stick around at the end to answer questions as well.
Thank you, David. That was fantastic.
Thank you.